Have you ever heard that saying, truth is stranger than fiction?
Mm-hmm.
Well, sometimes it's not just strange.
Right.
It's downright chilling.
Yeah.
And that's what we're exploring in this deep dive. The case of Daniel Brophy, a beloved chef whose life was cut short, and the trial of his wife, Nancy Crampton Brophy, a romance novelist whose words took on a really sinister new meaning. We'll be sifting through court transcripts, interviews, news articles, and even Nancy's own writings to uncover the truth behind this captivating and tragic case.
It really is a case that blurs the lines between imagination and reality, I think.
Yeah.
Forcing us to ask, can fiction foreshadow fact? Did Nancy's writing merely reflect her creative mind, or did it hint at something far more sinister?
Let's start by getting a sense of who Daniel Brophy was. You've given me a lot of material about his life and work, and it paints a picture of a man who was truly passionate about food and dedicated to his community.
Absolutely. Daniel wasn't just a chef instructor at the Oregon Culinary Institute. He was a pillar of the Portland culinary scene. He was known for his infectious enthusiasm, his mentorship of aspiring chefs, and his commitment to giving back. He volunteered at a retirement home and a soup kitchen, always willing to share his love of food with others.
From what I've read, his students absolutely adored him.
They did.
They describe him as a patient and inspiring teacher, always willing to go the extra mile to help them succeed.
Yes, and his colleagues emphasize his unwavering dedication. He was the kind of person who was always the first one in and the last one out,
Wow.
always going above and beyond. He was also a passionate mushroom enthusiast, leading foraging expeditions and teaching others about the wonders of the fungal world.
He sounds like a truly remarkable individual.
Yeah,
It makes his sudden death all the more heartbreaking.
it really does. It's a stark contrast to the woman at the center of this mystery, his wife, Nancy Crampton Brophy. From the sources you provided, she comes across as a complex and somewhat contradictory figure. A former culinary entrepreneur, she had transitioned into writing romance novels, particularly those in the bodice ripper genre, filled with passion, danger, and intrigue.
And that's where things start to get really interesting, wouldn't you say? Because years before Daniel's murder, Nancy wrote an essay titled, How to Murder Your Husband.
Yes, an essay that would later become a focal point of the investigation.
Right.
And add a chilling layer to this already complex case. In it, she delves into the various motives for murdering a spouse, explores different methods, and even cautions against hiring a hitman.
It's almost as if she was writing a blueprint for the crime she would later be accused of committing.
Yeah, it's strange.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's rewind a bit and look at the events leading up to Daniel's death.
Sure, the sources indicate that the couple was experiencing some financial difficulties in the years prior to the murder.
Okay.
Their income had declined, and they were increasingly relying on Daniel's 401k to make ends meet.
I see.
Nancy's spending habits, particularly on what she described as research for her writing, seemed to exacerbate their financial strain. She even purchased a Victorian chastity belt, which seems a bit out of character for someone struggling financially, wouldn't you say?
It certainly raises eyebrows. And then there's the matter of the numerous life insurance policies Nancy had taken out on Daniel, totaling nearly $800,000.
Right.
That's a substantial sum, especially considering their financial situation.
It paints a picture of potential financial gain as a motive, a theory that would become central to the prosecution's case. But before we delve into the investigation and the evidence, let's take a moment to understand the woman at the heart of this story.
Let's talk about Nancy. She met Daniel at culinary school,
Mm-hmm.
and it's worth noting that he was actually married at the time.
Yes,
Their relationship began as an affair, eventually leading to Daniel's divorce and their subsequent marriage.
that's right. And it's a detail that adds another layer of complexity to their relationship dynamic. Their shared passion for food brought them together,
Right.
but their path to marriage was unconventional, to say the least.
Okay, we have a beloved chef, a wife with a penchant for writing about murder, and some financial troubles lurking in the background. What happened next? How did this seemingly ordinary life take such a dark turn?
Well, to understand that, we need to go back to that fateful morning in June when Daniel Brophy's life was tragically cut short.
Okay.
And that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss it.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the murder of Daniel Brophy. In part 1, we learned about Daniel's life, his passions, and the woman who would later be accused of his murder, his wife, Nancy Crampton Brophy. Now we're going to examine the events surrounding his death and the unraveling of a web of deceit that led investigators right to Nancy's doorstep.
As we discussed, Daniel was a man of routine. He was always the first one to arrive at the Oregon Culinary Institute each morning, diligently disabling the alarm and preparing his classroom for the day's lessons.
It's almost ironic, isn't it? This predictable routine that brought him so much comfort and stability ultimately made him vulnerable on that fateful morning.
Precisely. It allowed investigators to establish a very precise time frame for the murder, making any deviation from that routine all the more suspicious.
And that's where the surveillance footage comes in.
Oh.
You mentioned that Nancy was seen driving by the school during that critical window. Not once, but twice.
Yes, and this footage directly contradicted her alibi of being sound asleep at home. It placed her at the scene of the crime during the time Daniel was murdered.
It seems incredibly careless, considering she wrote about covering up murders. You'd think she would have been more aware of surveillance cameras.
It certainly raises questions about her level of planning and foresight. But remember, this is also the same woman who claimed to have purchased a gun for research but never fired it.
That's hard to believe, isn't it? If you're that interested in guns, especially for research purposes, wouldn't you at least want to familiarize yourself with how it works?
It's a discrepancy that added fuel to the fire of suspicion surrounding Nancy. Then there's the matter of the Glock 9mm, the same caliber used to kill Daniel.
Right. The gun she claimed was for research and had never been fired. But as you pointed out, forensic testing revealed that it didn't match the bullets found at the crime scene.
Exactly. Initially, this appeared to be a dead end for investigators, but their persistence paid off in a rather dramatic way.
And this is where the story takes another unexpected turn, right?
Indeed. They discovered that Nancy had purchased replacement parts for a Glock 9mm on eBay, swapping out several components of the gun before turning it over to the police.
Wow, she thought she could just change a few parts and outsmart forensic science. It seems incredibly naive, almost arrogant considering the gravity of the situation.
It certainly suggests a belief that she could manipulate the system, a belief that would ultimately prove to be her downfall.
So we have surveillance footage placing Nancy at the scene of the crime, a potential financial motive, and a modified gun that could be linked to the murder. It's starting to look like a pretty solid case against her.
Yes, but the legal system is rarely black and white. There's always another side to the story, a counter-narrative that seeks to challenge the prosecution's claims.
And that's where the trial comes in, right? This clash of narratives, the prosecution presenting evidence of cold-blooded murder, and the defense arguing for Nancy's innocence and love for Daniel.
Precisely. The trial was a high-stakes battle with both sides presenting their arguments and calling witnesses to support their claims. And at the center of it all was Nancy Crampton Brophy, the woman who once wrote about how to get away with murder, now fighting to prove her own innocence.
Before we dive into that courtroom drama, let's take a step back and talk about the murder scene itself. What did investigators find when they arrived at the Oregon Culinary Institute that morning?
The crime scene was particularly perplexing. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of a struggle, and Daniel's personal belongings were undisturbed. It pointed to a targeted attack, someone who knew Daniel's routine and had access to the building.
So someone like a staff member or a student?
Possibly. But remember, the murder weapon was never found at the scene. This suggested a level of premeditation, someone who had planned the crime carefully and taken steps to dispose of the evidence.
Okay, so we have a premeditated murder, a potential financial motive, and a wife whose alibi has been shattered. But what about the essay, that infamous How to Murder Your Husband piece? Did it play a role in the trial?
That's a great question, and one that sparked considerable debate during the legal proceedings. Ultimately, the judge decided to exclude the essay from the trial, ruling that its prejudicial nature outweighed its probative value.
That's interesting. It makes sense, I guess, but it also feels like a missed opportunity. Wouldn't that essay have provided some insight into Nancy's state of mind, her thoughts on murder, even if it was just fiction?
Perhaps, but the judge was concerned that the jury might be unduly influenced by the essay's content, potentially convicting Nancy based on her writing, rather than the actual evidence presented.
So the essay was out, but the financial motive, the surveillance footage, and the modified gun were all in play. What was the defense's strategy? How did they try to counter such seemingly damning evidence?
Well, that's where the trial takes a fascinating turn. A battle of narratives that would ultimately determine Nancy Crampton Brophy's fate. And that's where we'll pick up in part 3 of our deep dive.
We're back for the final part of our deep dive into the trial of Nancy Crampton Brophy. We've examined the evidence, the inconsistencies, and the lingering questions surrounding the murder of her husband, Daniel.
Right.
Now let's step into the courtroom and witness the clash of narratives that would determine her fate.
The courtroom was packed with anticipation as the trial unfolded. The prosecution meticulously presented their case, weaving together a tapestry of circumstantial evidence that pointed directly at Nancy.
Yeah.
They highlighted the financial motive, emphasizing the couple's financial strain and the significant payout Nancy stood to gain from Daniel's life insurance policies.
Right.
They presented expert testimony on ballistics, linking the modified Glock 9mm to the type of bullets used to kill Daniel. And of course, they showcased the damning surveillance footage, placing Nancy at the scene of the crime during the crucial time frame.
It sounds like a pretty airtight case.
Yeah.
What was the defense's strategy? How did they try to counter such compelling evidence?
The defense faced an uphill battle, but they fought back with a strategy focused on casting doubt on the prosecution's narrative.
Okay.
They argued that the prosecution's case was purely circumstantial, lacking any direct evidence that definitively linked Nancy to the murder. They portrayed Nancy and Daniel as a loving couple working through their financial challenges, suggesting that the life insurance policies were simply a responsible measure to protect their future. They even called character witnesses who attested to Nancy's kind nature and loving relationship with Daniel.
So they were trying to create a reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors, suggesting that perhaps there was another explanation,
Right.
another suspect that the prosecution had overlooked.
Exactly. And a key element of their strategy was to humanize Nancy, to present her not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a grieving widow who was struggling to cope with the sudden loss of her husband. They highlighted her emotional distress, her inconsistent statements, and her claims of memory lapses as evidence of her innocence, suggesting that she was simply too distraught and confused to remember the events surrounding Daniel's death.
It's a bold strategy, especially considering the weight of evidence against her. Did the jury buy it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to find the answer, we have to turn our attention to the most dramatic moment of the trial, Nancy's own testimony.
Okay, this is the part I've been waiting for. What happened when Nancy took the stand?
It was a captivating spectacle, a true courtroom drama. Under oath, Nancy maintained her innocence, denying any involvement in Daniel's murder. She attempted to explain away the incriminating evidence, suggesting that the surveillance footage was simply a coincidence, that she had been driving around aimlessly trying to clear her head. She claimed that the gun parts purchased online were for research purposes, even though she had never actually fired a gun. And most dramatically, she insisted that she had no memory of being at the Oregon Culinary Institute on the morning of Daniel's death, suggesting that stress and grief had caused her to experience memory lapses.
So she was playing the amnesia card, hoping that a plea of emotional distress and foggy memories would sway the jury in her favor.
Precisely. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. They relentlessly cross-examined Nancy,
Right?
picking apart her story, highlighting inconsistencies, and challenging her memory lapses. They pointed out the improbable nature of her explanations,
I see.
emphasizing that her actions were those of someone covering up a crime, not those of a grieving widow.
It must have been intense, a battle of wits and words with Nancy's freedom hanging in the balance.
It was a true test of credibility, a clash of narratives that left the jurors with the ultimate responsibility of deciding who to believe.
Yeah.
The prosecution's version of a calculated killer, or the defense's portrayal of a distraught and confused widow.
And after weeks of testimony, deliberation, and suspense, the jury reached a verdict.
Yes, a verdict that would seal Nancy Crampton Brophy's fate. On May 25, 2022, the jury found Nancy guilty of second-degree murder.
Wow. So despite the defense's efforts, the jury ultimately believed the prosecution's story.
They did. The weight of circumstantial evidence combined with Nancy's unconvincing testimony proved too much to overcome. The judge sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years.
What a dramatic end to a complex and disturbing case. But even with the verdict, there is still so many questions swirling around this story. Was Nancy's writing a reflection of her inner desires? Did her imagination spill over into reality, or was she truly a victim of circumstance wrongly convicted based on a web of coincidences?
Those are questions we may never fully answer. But one thing is certain. This case is a chilling reminder that truth can be stranger than fiction, and the line between imagination and reality can sometimes be blurred beyond recognition.
It's a reminder that behind seemingly ordinary lives, dark secrets can lurk, and the human heart is capable of both profound love and chilling betrayal. Well, this deep dive into the murder of Daniel Brophy has been a journey into the complexities of human nature, the power of words, and the fragility of truth.
It really has.
It's a story that will stay with me for a long time. Thanks for guiding us through this fascinating, if somewhat disturbing, deep dive.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listeners, we encourage you to continue exploring, questioning, and engaging with the stories that shape our world. Until next time, keep diving deep.